It's always quite surreal looking back on the indie and alternative music scenes in Australia in the 1990s. Even well after the grunge explosion, it seemed like literally anything could happen. You had Recovery broadcasting all kinds of non-mainstream culture, be it musical or otherwise, every Saturday morning on ABC.
For those young'uns who are not accustomed to plenty of Indiana Jones, you'll probably love this outing, The Mummy, an enjoyable film.
You had Regurgitator reaching the top 20 of the national chart with a song about a sex doll. And one of the most promising Aussie bands of 1998 was a trio of 30-somethings who had a cult underground hit with a song that's almost entirely in German.
Sich Öffnen, erklär mir, wie das gehen soll, denn meine Schachteln.
The band's frontman was Heinz Riegler, who was born not in Australia, but Austria. After originally moving to London in 1986, Riegler started playing with two Aussie musicians that were living in the UK at the time, bass player Anthony Hills and drummer Simon Lambert. In 1991, they decided on a band name that reflected the fact that none of them were born in the UK, Not From There. The band attempted to make a name for themselves in Europe until Hills and Lambert's visas expired and they were both deported back to Australia. Lambert ultimately convinced Riegler to relocate in order to keep the Not From There project going, and in 1993 the pair reconvened with Hills in Brisbane. Not From There put out their first Australian release in 1994, a 7-track EP, before in 1995 it was Riegler's turn to be deported, this time of course back to Austria. But by mid-1997, Riegler was securely back in Australia and the band had signed with Infectious Records. Over an 18-month period, the band put out a self-titled EP as well as a couple of singles, with the release that turned the most heads being the single Sich Öffnen. The band's debut album Sand on 7 dropped in November 1998. An album of experimental indie rock, shifting between fairly abrasive riffs and noise, and spacier moments with more dub-inspired production, as well as some dance music influence through their heavy focus on rhythms and their use of samplers. Sich Öffnen is perhaps one of the less aggressive and more streamlined tracks on Sand on 7, but still showcases Not From There's peculiarity through its slightly unusual guitar chords, and of course the fact that most Aussies could have only sung along with the chorus and the one English-sounding German line.
Meine Musik ist negativ.
Triple J played Sich Öffnen quite a lot on their station in 1998, and in their Hottest 100 for the year, the song just snuck into the countdown at number 100. In 1999, Not From There were reportedly voted to number 2 in a Best New Band Readers poll run by Rolling Stone, and they were nominated for 3 ARIA Awards at the 1999 ceremony,
Not from there.
winning one in the Best Adult Alternative Album category. Whilst many bands would have celebrated this occasion, Lambert instead took the opportunity to speak out on behalf of musicians that were struggling to make money in the industry at the time, which still included Not From There themselves.
I just want to thank sort of all the other bands in this country that sort of play on the dole and really know how shit it is for new bands to start up and really sort of grab that term alternative, because we don't really deserve it, you know, we're signed to a record company.
Similarly, Riegler remembers feeling that that event may have been the beginning of the end for the band, and also worried that the band could start compromising on their sound in order to appeal to a greater audience. That might have been what listeners were thinking when Not From There re-emerged after their ARIA Award win, with some pretty radical changes to their sound. If their next single, Sticky Wes, wasn't an immediate giveaway that their second album would be vastly different,
Lights are bright, someone else's pain, and we feel
then it was extremely apparent in their next single, which was called Frisco Disco. In September 2000, Not From There dropped their second full-length album, Latvian Lovers. The album certainly still reflected Not From There's experimental nature, but it was more explorative of the band's playful and sometimes even calm side, rather than focusing on buzzsaw guitars and grinding bass. The handful of reviews of Latvian Lovers that happened at the time and can still be found online are generally positive. Maybe the problem was that there wasn't all that much discourse around this album beyond those reviews. Frisco Disco did apparently scrape into the national top 100, but with Latvian Lovers essentially sinking without a trace, and tension always building between the members of the band, in 2001, Not From There were not anymore. In a 2017 interview with Double J, Heinz Riegler admitted that he no longer kept in contact with Simon Lambert or Anthony Hills, and in the 2022 book Sound as Ever, A write-up about Not From There and what happened following their breakup reiterates that a reunion is definitely not to be expected.
Shit.
But that write-up also points out that it's Anthony Hills who was able to archive most of Not From There's discography on their Bandcamp page. So thanks to Anthony's archiving, I can make this video not just about the band's 2 studio albums, which is all that's up on most major streaming services, but also some more deep cuts. So on that, let's get more into what exactly the Not From There sound was like over the years. Not From There put out their first releases in 1992 when they were still based in London. Their debut EP, Conned, was apparently produced by Mark E. Smith. And also, at the time, Not From There were a 4-piece, with the addition of lead guitarist Matt Groom. Also, Hines apparently decided to call himself Chris Brown on this LP, but that doesn't explain who the hell McDarby is, or Rivers, or Aggro. Many of these questions will remain unanswered, as Hines has hidden most of the vinyls of Conned in his parents' basement. Unless you can find someone who actually bought the LP in London in 1992, then you're never going to be able to hear it. However, 2 live performances of songs from Conned did appear on the Archival and Live Recordings compilation on Not From There's Bandcamp. Based on those 2 live recordings, my instinct is that we're not really missing out on much here. Despite how scarce this EP is, someone was able to put the album art up on its Discogs page, which is more than can be said about Not From There's second release from 1992, the cassette Polished Wooden Floors, which doesn't even have a Discogs page at all. On the remnants of the old Not From There website that can be recovered with the Wayback Machine, we've got a very small image of the cover of Polished Wooden Floors, and we also get the track list and some notes from Hines pointing out that the second side of the cassette was a set of live recordings and that they recorded Polished Wooden Floors to try and make up for what they felt was the miserable failure of Conned. You can hear 2 songs from Polished Wooden Floors on that archival compilation, with those songs kind of sounding somewhere between punk and grunge. Certainly not the level of quality that the band would reach towards the end of the decade, but still enjoyable enough for me. I think that's all the info that we have out there about that release, but it also has one of the least Google-friendly names of all time. Same with the band name itself, even if you combine it with one of their song titles. In 1993, Not From There were briefly based in the capital of Slovakia, Bratislava, something which is often pointed out in write-ups about the band online. However, they actually recorded their next release in the Czech Republic with engineer Ivan Chervenka at a studio in Ostrava. Apparently Anthony Hills couldn't make it to Europe this time, as they instead recorded with a bassist named Yuri Stverka, whose other major achievement was disappearing off the face of the earth, apparently. Back in Brisbane, the EP was mixed and mastered by local producer Lachlan Gould, better known as Magoo, and he would produce all of Not From There's music from this point on. The EP was released in 1994 under the title Valid to 0695. It was put out by an independent label called Malignant Records, whose catalogue numbers all started with Tumour. However, the influence of the label was cut short by the sudden passing of founder Monty Blomfield in August 94. Anyway, Valid to 0695 is a raw release in a sort of post-hardcore noise rock vein. The much less mechanical feel to the rhythms on this EP make this effectively their last set of pure rock songs. And sometimes it seems to be going for a little bit of shock value that doesn't really land either. The song that sounds the most like what Not From There would do later is the closing track Can You Tell Me, which is a quieter, more drony song where Riegler has more of a whispery vocal and the percussion is somewhat minimal. It's not a bad EP at all if you're prepared for something that sounds like it's a little bit restrained. By the way, the track Slow Song is a re-recording of another song from Polished Wooden Floors. The original version is in more of a hippie-ish sounding arrangement with bongos and tambourine and guest pianist Russell Cherney. And that version is also available thanks to its appearance on the Malignant Records compilation called That. Looking at the band's history, it seems like the slightly cryptic name of that EP was just a reference to when Hines' Aussie visa was going to expire, but deliberately or not, it also signalled that Not From There's music was never going to be quite the same after that point. Fast forward to July 1997. when in less than 2 weeks, Not From There and Magoo recorded and mixed 9 finished songs. 5 of those songs came out later that year on Not From There's self-titled EP, which set the blueprint for what their sound would be like over the coming 18 months. Lambert was starting to drive their songs more than ever with his insistent and more danceable drum rhythms, and Hills was anchoring these songs with his slabs of fuzz bass. The guitars often shift between thunderous power chords and frantic post-punk strumming, and Riegler started to find his signature voice, adopting a more cool and detached delivery. However, he was still prone to sudden bouts of screaming. These elements basically make up the essence of the self-titled EP tracks Let Me Out, No Answers, and Can't Shake Him, with No Answers being the first Not From There song to predominantly feature German lyrics. Meanwhile, Chinchilla is closer to a math rock song, with its opening arpeggio and its stop-start time signature, before throwing in some spacey sound effects and building up to a pounding alt-metal refrain. And just to live up to the band's name even more, the final track on the EP is called Cuando Está de Vuelta, a song where Hines indulges more in his abstract musical leanings, layering spoken word, feedback, and a whole bunch of other weird noises over a very simple and gently strummed chord progression. I think the band may have already been using samplers at this point in order to create loops of drum parts and other noises, but the sampling became a lot more audible on their follow-up single What Is Better, released mid-1998. Lambert's shuffling drum parts start to resemble breakbeats more than ever, and in the middle of the song, a second rhythm starts overlaying the main drum part. And at one point, the music gives way to a very off-kilter, unsourced jazz loop.
What is better? What is better? What is better?
You could tell that Not From There had a bit more of a live approach to their use of electronic instruments rather than simply programming these sounds in a computer, at least at this earlier point in time. What Is Better was also backed by one of the band's best ever B-sides, a nearly 9-minute roller coaster ride called Argentinians, where most of Riegler's vocals are just him going like... before he delivers some sage advice to the people of the titular nationality.
Argentinians should never play Simon and Garfunkel songs late at night to Italian toilet cleaners.
Okay, but what exactly did you mean by that, Hines? Yep, that answers all my questions. Thanks, mate. A couple of months later, What Is Better was followed up by Not From There's breakthrough single, Sich Öffnen. Then, in November 1998, they put out their debut record, Sand on 7. Allocating just over a month to complete the full album, Not From There and Magoo indulged in not just more electronic sounds, but also added in some more conceptual recordings, such as that of Simon throwing his cymbals down a staircase, Anthony waving some paper towels in front of a microphone, Hines adding in samples of various international weather reports sent to him by one of his European friends, and having multiple overlaid recordings of Hines, Simon and Magoo having fake arguments with each other. This album is Not From There being able to stretch out and really deliver on the potential that they showed in their earlier EPs and singles. The band's constant stylistic shifting between the likes of breakneck punk, languid and mysterious psychedelia, and combinations of pounding guitar and precise drumming that are like borderline industrial metal makes for a unique and a pretty damn entertaining full-length album experience. Certainly unique, that's for sure. Case in point, this writer from back in the day was only able to make distant comparisons between Not From There and bands like The Fall, Sonic Youth, Slint, Mudhoney, and Girls Against Boys. Out of those bands, I can mostly hear Sonic Youth and Slint in Sand on 7, the former especially in the album's third single, Wine Eater's Cocktail Party, with its Silver Rocket-esque verse riff and sugarcane-esque build-up section in the middle, and I can hear a bit of Slint in Not From There's occasional math rock tendencies, and in songs like Album Closer, 3 words repeated with its big dynamic contrasts. For local examples of bands that were doing somewhat similar things to what Not From There were doing, we go back to Regurgitator, who are also a Brisbane band, with another Aussie group that's somewhat comparable in my mind being Sydney trio Girling. Both of those bands had evolved from punky guitar acts to bands that were still doing that sort of thing, but also unabashedly embracing electronica. Both of them also worked with Magoo at various points. However, Girling's more guitar-driven songs were a lot less muscular than what Not From There were doing. Plus, by the time they released their debut album, Children of Telepathic Experiences, they already had a greater focus on electronics and guitars. That was one of the albums that lost the Best Alternative Release award to Sand on 7, by the way. As for Regurgitator, their approach to synthesizers and melodies have both generally been in a more sugary, new wave kind of vein. Meanwhile, Not From There certainly weren't naming their songs things like, I sucked a lot of cock to get where I am. Although they did almost put out a song called Piss on Me. Anyway, most of the apparent humour in Not From Their songs just comes through a general sense of absurdity and randomness.
Argentinians should never play.
Riegler's thing with his lyrics seem to be writing individual lines that are intriguing and even somewhat poetic in a way that's hard to describe, but looking at the bigger picture, the songs seem to not really mean too much overall. This is in reference to the English lyrics on this album. When you look at translations of the German parts, albeit possibly translated more literally compared to their intended meaning, I'm not too sure if they were really designed to be translated. Although if this translation of Abgedroschen is fairly accurate, then it seems like Heinz was doing a meta-commentary on his whole lyrical approach. I think that's pretty cool, but not as cool to me as What Is Better Now, an updated version of What Is Better, which retains most of the musical elements from the original version on the single, and combines it with a remix of the song done by a guy called John Gardner. So in the middle of this version, instead of going into some uncredited jazz sample, it instead turns into like an acid techno breakdown. Then towards the end you even get like the house music rise effect where everything just starts building in volume.
Okay, let's go.
And at points it's like there's up to 4 different rhythm parts overlaid over the top of each other and interlocking. It just sounds fucking sick, like a lot of other parts on this album. On the track The Corkscrew, Heinz does a little shout out to which is probably quite a strong influence on Not From There, as following the release of the influential Dr. Octagonacologist album, a lot of Not From There songs started to have more of a hip-hop feel in their growing rhythmic tightness. But apart from What Is Better Now and The Corkscrew, which ends with a pulsating techno wind down, Stand on 7 is still very much rock-oriented. But if you do like the more electronic elements on this album, then you'll be happy to know that for the next album, Not From There took those electronic elements and really ran off with them. Stand on 7 was distributed in the US by Cool Arrow Records in 1999, and a Not From There tour of the US soon followed. Riegler recounts that he entered a bar in San Francisco where he overheard someone paying tribute to a forgotten American beatnik poet during a poetry gathering. The poet was named Albert Wez, nicknamed Sticky. Riegler was intrigued enough by this that shortly before Not From There moved over to Japan for the next part of their tour, Riegler picked up a book by Albert Wez called Frisco Disco Superstar and read that Wez claimed to have an unusual eye condition where the only colours he could identify were bright pink and white, and Riegler felt that he could somewhat relate to Wez's weird eye condition whilst looking at all of the bright neon lights in Japan. Those experiences would shape the next 2 singles that Not From There would release, the first of those being named after Sticky Wez. The music video for Sticky Wez subsequently made use of Japanese writing and robotic geisha dances, with practically the only visible colours in the video being pink and white. Heinz's copy of Frisco Disco Superstar also makes an appearance in the video, and Not From There's follow-up single would take its name from that book, not just being a general description of the music within. Now, without any of that context, to me, Sticky Wez just sounded like a general song about recounting life on the road, and Frisco Disco just sounds like a piss take on a let's go out and party kind of song. Riegler says that Wez never got any credit for his work despite being at the forefront of 40s American beatnik poetry. Those other beatnik poets must have hated him so much that they tried to fully erase him from history. I eventually found a review of Frisco Disco in the University of Queensland student newspaper, where the writer, whose name definitely isn't Mark Gomez, repeats a lot of what Riegler said about Albert Wez in that other interview with Nick Kopak for Oz Music Project, but also adds a couple of details that weren't given about Wez in that Not From There interview. So I am leaning towards Albert Wez being a real person and not some elaborate Not From There in-joke. Especially when Riegler gives off the impression that whenever he said something as a joke, you'll definitely know it was a joke. However, searching the name Albert Wez only brings up completely unrelated people. This is one of the only instances of the word sticky followed by Wez that I could find that wasn't directly tied to the Not From There song. And apparently these are the only 2 articles available online to feature the exact phrase Frisco Disco Superstar.
I have no knowledge of any of this. This is so bizarre.
Based on that, there's probably not much point in asking this, but if you know for a fact that Albert Wes existed and you're able to point me in the direction of more resources where I can read about his history and poetry, then please do that in the comments. The switch up to shuffling electro-funk on Sticky Wes and glitzy Europop on Frisco Disco was mainly down to Not From There's desire to keep evolving their sound, rather than an attempt to try and appeal to the pop crowd. In fact, the band hadn't even written any songs when they went back into the studio to start recording another album, and that led to their second and ultimately final full-length album, Latvian Lovers, going in quite a few different stylistic directions. Though in most of those directions, Heinz's guitar was going chugga-chugga rather than chug-chug. Most of the distortion or fuzz on Latvian Lovers is applied to either electronic parts or bass. Opening track Rhinoceros Tap Dance takes the funk in a bit more of a psychedelic direction, with forceful drumming from Lambert that's a little bit more reminiscent of the previous album, and Riegler's boastful vocals broken up by moments where it sounds like he's using his voice as another percussion instrument. Later in the track list, the hitching post picks up where Sticky Wes left off, and for one of the only times in Not From There's discography, the drums sound fully electronic rather than being sampled from Lambert's live drums. In the middle of the album, however, things take a bit of a left turn from the funk and disco before it. The fifth track, Ghost in Texas, is a slower number with Riegler longing for a missing girlfriend. The music is largely driven by Regurgitator's touring keyboardist Shane Rudkin, playing a simple synth string part and a digital marimba line, whilst Riegler also provides some spare and plaintive guitar lines. Then the following track, Breakfast with Valentine, has one of the few instances of chugging guitars on Latvian Lovers, but instead of being piercing and metallic like much of Not From There's heavier songs in the years prior, this song dips its feet into the shoegaze realm. Heinz's disembodied words are largely obscured by the multi-layered droning and pitch-bending guitars in the verses, then the chorus hits with a wave of distortion unlike on any other song that Not From There ever did. Speaking of unlike any other Not From There song, the album suddenly turns into a fiesta on the track 180 Yabajo, with rollicking percussion of a slightly more exotic variety and largely Spanish dialogue provided by Mexican singer Pinche Peach. Peach was also signed to Not From There's American distributor Cool Arrow Records as a member of the band Brujeria, who make music that sounds a bit like this. Let's see what happens when we put Pinche Peach's Not From There song underneath this music video. I don't know about you, but I didn't notice anything different. Anyways, that madness is followed by the more down-tempo, chilled-out trip-hop of Lounge Anthem, featuring additional vocals from Tylee, Magoo's wife. Then the album closes with Silence Amongst the Revolutionaries, another guitar-driven song. But again, instead of blasting distortion, the guitars are woozy and just about everything is slathered in a very wet delay effect, a style that vaguely reminds me of the spaced-out slowcore of Duster's Stratosphere album. So as I said before, the spontaneity of the writing and recording of Latvian Lovers meant that it ended up not reflecting just one musical genre, leading Riegler to describe the album to Nick Kopak as cosmic new age avant-garde pop. It's a fascinating album in that it seems committed to all of the different musical directions that it heads into, rather than trying to shove a bunch of different sounds onto one album as a gimmick. Whilst I do ultimately prefer Sand on 7 on a song-by-song basis, there's still plenty to like about Latvian Lovers. The band wrote on their website that Frisco Disco video was getting a decent amount of TV airtime, and that even Rhinoceros Tap Dance, which wasn't released as a single, was in the rotation on Triple J. So why did Latvian Lovers basically drop like a stone? One might look at things overall and think that there may have just been a backlash against their change in sound, but firstly, I don't think Not From There's following was big enough yet to be killed off by that sort of backlash alone. And secondly, this was 2001. You know who released their debut album that year? Gorillaz, with an album combining rock, hip-hop and electronica that has now sold 7 million copies. Incidentally, co-produced by Dan the Automator, who also produced most of that Dr. Octagon album. Also, remember Girling? Well, in 2001, they put out a disco-flavoured single of their own. And it reached the national top 50, which is a pretty big achievement for a band that are as all over the place as Girling. You gonna try and tell me that there couldn't have possibly been a market for Frisco Disco at the very least? And how does a band go from performing at the biggest music festival in the country, with their performance being broadcast on Channel V, to leaving me no choice but to use random footage from a Formula 1 game just because the uploader put Rhinoceros Tap Dance underneath it? To me, a lot of this looks like it was down to serious mismanagement from Not From There's record label. But while they're definitely not the only reason that Not From There broke up in the way that they did, it seems pretty apparent that they're the main reason why Not From There have almost been completely forgotten since then. I first got into Not From There's music while watching their official music videos for Sich Öffnen and One Eater's Cocktail Party, but at some point in the years that followed, that all changed. Thanks to our great friends over at WMG. Yes, Infectious Records had been integrated into the Australian label Mushroom Records, and Mushroom Records was later sold to Warner Music Group. And now, because WMG definitely don't have negative brain cells, Australians can no longer watch the official music videos on YouTube for an Australian band. In order to do that, you have to be Not From There, with there being every single country and territory on planet Earth except the United States for some fucking reason. I genuinely thought that Not From There must have just not made a music video for Sticky Wes at all, until I eventually found it on Apple Music, as well as official videos for Rhinoceros Tap Dance and What Is Better that I didn't know existed either. It's very little wonder that Not From There haven't had all that much of a resurgence, given that their music videos are now behind a fucking paywall. And that's on top of at least half of Not From There's discography being unavailable to stream anywhere except Bandcamp, only thanks to the initiative of one of the band's members. So yeah, to any Warner Music Group employees that may happen to stumble across this video, you are worthless. Go fuck yourself. Thankfully, the director of the music video for One Eater's Cocktail Party uploaded on his Vimeo page, so you can go watch it there. Shout out David Granado. And the Frisco Disco music video is completely available for us on YouTube. Not sure why Warner didn't want anything to do with that one. Maybe they were afraid of the mass hysteria that would have been caused by Anthony and Simon being too goddamn sexy. Alright, this is an add-on to what was originally going to be the final version of the video. If you look up the band on YouTube, you'll probably find this channel cleverly titled Not From There. What's this? Sich Öffnen official music video, you say? That cannot be, can it? Oh, it sure sounds like it. And, well, the original video wasn't split into 9 duplicates, but that is the music video on YouTube. So yeah, you can watch it on YouTube like this if you can't be bothered to pay for Apple Music to watch it in full screen. But I feel like this at least, you know, gives you the gist of the videos, I think. But anyways, yeah, it's suck eggs, Warner. The lukewarm reception of Latvian Lovers was the final nail in the coffin for a band that was starting to drift apart from each other. To quote Riegler in his Double J interview, he'd wandered out for a while and the moment had come. So even if Not From There hadn't been completely chewed up and spat out by the music industry, they might not have stuck around for all that much longer. Riegler's first releases after the demise of Not From There were as part of a collective called IO3, which put out 2 releases in 2002 that veered between the ambient and the avant-garde. Riegler did later make a return to the rock world in 2004, forming the hyperactive post-punk trio Nightstick, with Tam Patton of IO3 on bass and former Regurgitator drummer Martin Lee. After releasing an EP and a split single with fellow Brisbane band The Greats, Nightstick came to an unceremonious end after Riegler was kicked out of the venue that they were playing in for physically attacking an audience member that was throwing ice cubes at him. This served as a wake-up call for Riegler to abandon conventional music performances for good, with his focus shifting more towards the likes of ambient electronica, noise pieces, sound art, and physical forms of art as well. In 2012, he co-founded an art exhibition called -20 Degree, with exhibitions being held every 2 years in Flachau, bringing Riegler back to the hometown that he left all those years ago in search of better music, and also the threat of military service, maybe. So in a way, things came full circle. Riegler still appears to be dividing his time between Austria and Australia. Meanwhile, Simon Lambert briefly drummed for a Japanese band called Zoo Bombs, not sure what he did after that, and Anthony Hills appears to have retreated from the music industry at large following the end of Not From There, but I do know that his nephew has been somewhat scarred by the Frisco Disco music video, so at least there's that. And there you go. I'm going to be impressed if I can turn this into a nearly half an hour long video, given the meagre amount of content there is about Not From There online. And that feels extremely criminal because, to me, these guys are one of the most intriguing and musically memorable Aussie bands of their era. At the very least, I think they should have had better opportunities to get their music out into the world, to have more of their exploits preserved for younger generations to stumble across later. Anyway, if you thought this video was interesting, then go and check out Not From There's music on Bandcamp, and feel free to check out some of the other videos that I've made about bands that I feel are quite underrated in this day and age. Hope you all have a good one, unless you're a WMG employee, in which case I reiterate, fuck you, and goodbye.